You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on the Old Testament historical books. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders. I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, and he's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
All right, this one is probably almost like a given. You know what this word is?
I think
It's
I
the
do,
word,
yeah.
yeah, it's the word anointed,
Uh-huh.
and it means like it's the word also that Mashiach or Messiah comes from.
Hmm.
In 2 Samuel 1:14, David says to him, "How is it that you are not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Now, at that point, remember that Saul and the
Yeah,
guy claimed that he had killed him and all that. But the
right.
question is, okay, what does anointed mean? Well, in this
Hmm.
case, it pretty much means the one that God has chosen to be the next leader, or to be the leader. And the
Yeah,
anointing is a process where they pour oil on their head, and it's indicating who's God's choice is, and that's basically what's going on here. In 1 Samuel 16:13, it says, "Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose and went to Ramah." Now, this kind of, that was the calling. Now, remember, we talked about it takes an awful long time. David's now been anointed, and yet
right.
Saul's still there. It takes,
Yeah,
years before David gets to actually be king.
yeah.
But there is an interesting usage of this in Isaiah 45, verse 1, when it says, "Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, who I've taken
Hmm.
by the right hand, to subdue nations before him and to loosen the loins of kings, to open
Yeah,
doors before him that gates may not be shut." Now here's a pagan king that God
right.
is anointing to be basically he's going to be the one that's chosen to deliver his people. So it doesn't really make them, it doesn't automatically assume that they are a real godly person or anything like
Yeah,
that. Even Saul, remember, Saul's
sure,
going
yeah,
to turn out to be pretty bad. Um,
yeah.
but so it's really important to just realize that's the one God has chosen or called to do a job. And basically Cyrus is anointed to do that job. So it's kind of interesting.
It's like a chosen kind of for a purpose. It doesn't really mean
Yeah.
holy necessarily, or like cleaned or anything like that, or like
Yeah.
it's more so does it not have like a moral meaning, you think, like anointed?
It doesn't seem to me. It seems like
Yeah,
it's a very practical, I mean, very heavy. I mean, it's very literal. It seems like to me,
yeah,
here's an anointing, but then it signifies that God's going to use that person to do a job.
right. Yeah,
So, all right. Well, I thought we'd get into that one because that word's going to have to be important for our
yeah,
discussion today.
yeah.
All right. Well, let's see where we are. So it's been a little while for us, but
Yeah.
we've got through First Samuel,
Uh-huh.
and in First Samuel, it talked about Samuel early days. It talked
Mhm.
about Samuel and Saul working together, and
Right.
then towards the end, it was Saul and David. So now, basically, Second Samuel is pretty much talking about David. It's going to
Yeah.
start with his early years, basically what he did, and then there's an appendix, and David's almost done after that.
Yeah.
You get into First Kings, and David's basically so old he can't really
Mm.
do anything. So
Right.
so it's really this part, this book, Second Samuel, that has the life of David pretty much. And
Yeah.
I think we talked about this before, but remember, Philistines were always a real problem for
Right.
the Israelites. Samuel has a problem with them. Saul does. Even David and Saul when they're together. But it's
Mhm.
during David's time now that it is going to have a final defeat of them, and from then on, the Philistines are pretty much done away.
It's not an issue
They're
anymore.
yeah, they're not an issue anymore.
Hmm.
All right, so there's where we are.
Okay.
All right, let's go through his early life. So first, David reacts to the news of Saul's death in chapter
Yeah.
1,
Mhm.
and basically, do you remember at the end of second or First Samuel, it said that Saul died and all of that, now we get a totally different story. This Amalekite is coming through, and he tells a totally different story. Like
Right.
he says he was the one that came along him, and he asked him to kill him and all this, and he gave him the crown to take. He makes it sound like he was going to bring it to David. Now,
Yeah.
my guess is that he wasn't going to do that. That he was basically going to steal the crown and
Yeah.
thought he could get away with it. He happens to come upon David, and now he's stuck. And he should have just told the truth. I think David
Right.
would have been a lot more lenient on him, but because he says he was the one that Saul asked him to kill him, so he went ahead and did it. Then David says, well, your own words tell us that
Yeah.
you killed the Lord's anointed. Why weren't you afraid to do that? So,
Yeah.
so it seems like to me. So I'm pretty convinced that the story in Second Samuel, or the First Samuel at the very end, is the correct story.
That's
And
how it
this
actually
guy,
happened.
yeah, and then this
Yeah.
story is the one that was made up because the guy this Malachite came across David and kind of surprised and didn't know what to do, and so he
Yeah.
makes this story up. So,
Yeah. I've
eh,
always thought that's an interesting that you go from First Samuel to Second Samuel, and you get these two kind of narratives of Saul's
yeah,
passing. That always
and
was kind of interesting whenever I read it.
they're both different.
Yeah.
What's
Right.
going on
Right.
here?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So then David kills him for saying that he had killed King Saul.
Right.
2 Samuel 1:14-50 says, then David said to him, how is it that you are not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of his young men and said, go cut him down, for he struck him and he died.
Hmm.
And then the whole next chapter, or the rest of that chapter, is David having a dirge for Saul and Jonathan. It was remember, David really did love Jonathan, and
Yeah.
Jonathan was basically allowing David to take over the throne, basically, and
Right.
so he really did seem to have uh, warm feelings for him. So I'm sure that this dirge really was really part of what he was feeling. Now remember,
Hmm.
it's also going to be very wise of him, because if he had any part in the death of Saul or Jonathan,
Yeah.
then it
He's
would
like
have
a
been a problem.
usurper. Yeah.
Yeah. But the way it is, it makes it so clear that he had nothing to do with it. And then this
Mm.
dirge makes it even clearer that it actually hurt him when it happened.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting story there. All right. Now, the first part of this is kind of interesting. Remember, David doesn't go to and become king over everything at this point. He goes to Hebron, and at that
Hmm.
point, he asks God what he should do, and Ishbosheth became king over the Israel in chapter 2, and then in Second Samuel chapter 3 verse 1 it says here, now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and
Hmm.
David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. So even though Ishbosheth was the king in the north, um, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom at this point were pretty much at odds, and so they took Saul's offspring, and David was in the southern part with Hebron and in that area. Remember, Bethlehem is going to be fairly close to Hebron, so my
Yeah.
guess is they're going to see them as basically connected,
Mm.
and so I think that's why he did it in Hebron instead of Bethlehem. I assume is so that he'd have more um, people on his side. He probably already had the people at Bethlehem because
Oh,
that was
sure.
like his relatives. So now he goes to Hebron, and so he's got the two major cities down south there on
Yeah.
his side, probably. So
Yeah.
I think it was a wise move on his part. All right. Then Joab kills Abner. David was actually gonna make Abner
Mm.
general over him. And remember, Joab several times is going to do things that really go against David.
Yeah.
But it does seem like David understands that he's not trying to undo David, but he's definitely make sure that Joab stays in power. It's kind of
Mm.
amazing. And David doesn't seem to be able to, um, you know, undo the things that he does. So it's kind of interesting. They've got kind of a love-hate relationship, but Joab does seem to be, he never does things to undo David. He's always pretty much substantiating his kingship, but
Yeah.
he certainly doesn't want to lose any power. And
Mm.
so here Abner gets killed.
Yeah.
2 Samuel 3:27 says, Then Abner returned to Hebron. Joab took him aside to the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the belly so that he died on account of the blood of Azazel, his brother. I don't know if you remember, but he had killed Azazel earlier, and
Mm.
so Joab was probably still a little upset about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he expressed that for sure. It's pretty.
Yeah.
I know. I feel like I say the word brutal a lot, but it is. It's. I mean, that's kind of
Yeah.
Shakespearean almost. You know.
Yeah. Well, then now the next story is about Ishbosheth.
Hmm.
Remember, he's up north. He's the king, and what happens is two of his own people from his own nation kill him. I'll read verse 7 and 8 for you. Here's this. Now they came into the house as he was lying on his bed in his bedroom, and they struck him and killed him and beheaded him. And they took his head and traveled by the way of the Arabah all night. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, Behold the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my lord the king vengeance this day on Saul and his descendants. Now, they must not have known David very well, because remember,
Right.
the last person who killed the Lord's anointed,
Yep.
David had him killed. Well,
Hmm.
that's going to happen to these guys too. They should have learned their story a little better, I guess. See,
Yeah.
they knew that Saul was often going against David and those kind of things. What they didn't know is that David doesn't want to be seen as uh, attacking Saul or anything like that, or removing him from kingship until
Yeah.
it's time for God to do it. And
Right.
this sounds like this is a time that's going to happen. So it's basically at this point that the Israelites now um, come into the and make it. We always call it a united monarchy. Well,
Mm.
it's not until right now that it actually becomes a united monarchy.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So David has them killed. Then he tries to find out if there anybody still in the line of David that he can honor. And there's this Mephibosheth person. And remember, Mephibosheth he was a child that was fairly young when
Right.
Saul was having all these problems with David,
Mm.
and apparently he was dropped or something like that, so that when he was young, something happened to him so that he couldn't walk very well. And from then
Mm.
on, Mephibosheth then is honored by David, and
Yeah.
and David has him come into the house. It's his own house and takes care of him. He actually
Hmm.
says at that point that he's doing it for Jonathan, because remember, him and Jonathan were good
Yeah.
friends.
Hmm.
Mephibosheth actually has his own land and stuff like that, but David wants to honor him, so he apparently still has some land from Saul. The kingship still has some, and so he still's got his land, and Ziba becomes his servant to take care of him. So an interesting story on Mephibosheth.
Well, there's like two layers at least happening here, right? There's kind of
Yeah,
like David's political, moves where he's bringing in
yeah,
someone from, the house of Saul and kind of bringing them inside his own house, and treating them well.
yeah,
Um, but like you said, there probably was an actual care he had or something that was maybe it was more connected to Jonathan than
yeah.
Mephibosheth, but there's some kind of real, emotive quality to this too, or some kind of actual honoring. I mean, do you think both those are happening
I
simultaneously?
think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Good. All right. So at that point, then David is made king over both parts of the house.
Yeah.
For 2 Samuel 5 says, Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel in and out. And the Lord said to you, You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. My understanding is that basically when they say, behold, you are bone of my bone and flesh of your flesh kind of thing, I'm sure that that comes from the Genesis passage.
Mm.
So the idea of you are connected to us and that,
Yeah.
but it's funny when they decide to split later on, they use the same kind of terminology and says, well,
Mm.
what makes you think that you're bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh? And then, so it doesn't seem like it's a real strong commitment when they don't
Yeah.
need it, but
Yeah.
when they do need it, it is. Oh,
Yeah.
another really important thing in chapter 5 is that David makes a new capital, and he tries, and my understanding is he takes a place that's basically neutral. Jerusalem at this point
Mm.
was taken by the Jebusites. They were the ones that controlled it.
Mm-hmm.
And that must have gone back and forth between the Israelites and the Jebusites at least several times. But apparently at this time, they were controlling Jerusalem. And David has a perfect spot here. He's got it, it's now between both countries, and so that
Yeah.
the people of Israel can't say, "Oh, you guys like Judah better because you're part
Right.
of them," and vice versa. So basically, by getting a neutral location, he can then have a much better connection with both sides. So
Right.
that's the location was second, the second part of that location was brilliant too, because Jerusalem is pretty much on a hill, so it's got
Mm.
sides, valleys on both sides, and basically
Easy to
on three
protect.
sides of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's easy to defend when war comes. So that was
Yeah.
another good reason. Um, Water is it has the Gihon
Of
Springs,
course. Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
a great place. If I mean, and it's usually a fast flowing spring, so they're going to have plenty of water. Even in times of, I remember, even in times when the Assyrians came against it, Hezekiah
Mm.
built. Hezekiah's tunnel to make sure that that water was inside, but that means it's a
Right.
good enough spring that it's constantly running too.
Yeah.
And then there's those political issues. So, to tell you the truth, Jerusalem was an excellent choice for a whole bunch of reasons. And so David was really wise to do that one.
Yeah.
Um, here's he actually says something that's really interesting. Verse 7, it says, nevertheless David captured the stronghold of Zion in the day of that is the city of David. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and blind. They had told him that the lame and blind would be able to keep them, they'd be able to
Mm.
repel the Israelites by even the blind and the lame.
Mm.
But he says those who are hated by David's soul. So he was kind of jabbing back at him
Right.
through the water tunnel. And the water tunnel at this point was probably what they call Warren Shaft. So I've tried to give you a picture of here how it works. It's the red circle is where the Warren Shaft actually is, and it can go all the way down, and they can put a bucket down there, dip it in water, and then pull it all the way back up. So
Mm-hmm.
my guess is that that was the best uh, they had for a pretty good water supply, but it's called the water tunnel or the throat basically in Hebrew. And
Mm.
so it's kind of neat that even back at that time, now we didn't even know it existed for a long time.
Really?
They found Hezekiah's tunnel, but they
Mm-hmm.
didn't know about Warren Shaft till at a different time. So it's
Huh.
kind of neat,
Yeah.
and it fits this passage I think really well.
Yeah. Right.
All right. Okay. Then they're going to have the ark moved. Verse 6 here in 2 Samuel 6 says, and when they came to the threshing floor of Nikon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, and the oxen nearly upset it. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of the Lord. Now, at that point, David then refuses to bring it in. But remember, they're bringing
Mm.
it in the same way the Canaanites, the Philistines,
Right.
had done it. David knew better than that. That's not how it was supposed to go. And, be
Yeah.
carried. So it's interesting. David refuses at this point. God has such a sense of humor, because then what he's going to do is they take it to a guy named Obed-Edom's house. And
Mm-hmm.
what's going to happen is that God is going to bless Obed-Edom's house because the ark is there. And then all of a sudden,
Oh, right.
David's all happy about bringing it in.
Yeah.
So,
Bring it
so,
back.
so
Yeah.
it exactly. Let me read verse 12 for you. It says, "And when it was told King David, saying, 'The Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God,' and David went and brought the ark of the God of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness." I just think that's over. I just think it's funny. At one
Yeah.
point, he's so upset with God, and now he's real happy to have it come in.
Get
No
it
one
in
in
here.
their right,
Yeah.
yeah, no one in their right mind would not want the blessings, right, that God's going to pour
Yeah.
out from that. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, it was just funny. Um, it is interesting, though. Um, this one I want to talk about, is David a priest or not?
Mm.
It in verse 13 it says, "And so it was when the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling." Now the he sounds like it's David. Um, and yet David is not a priest. Now it's possible that
Yeah.
David could have them sacrificed. So at this point, it's he could be responsible for it. So that's
Yeah. Yeah.
that's at least there. But then verse 14 says, "And David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod."
Yeah.
The linen ephod is only worn by priests.
Right.
So that's gotta, so even that David knows that he is okay to wear it, because remember, other priests, or other kings in the Old Testament have done things like, even Saul gets in trouble for sacrificing
Right.
when he wasn't supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Uzziah gets leprosy for burning
Mm.
incense, I assume, in the temple. So God gets really upset when the wrong people either offer sacrifices or even make incense to God. But
Right.
David seems to know that it's okay for him to do it. So
Yeah.
how did that happen? Well,
Yeah.
I got something I want to show you.
Okay.
I actually think that David is in the line of Melchizedek, and because
Mm.
of that, he can be a king and a priest. I don't know if you remember Melchizedek, but he's back in Genesis 14,
Mm-hmm.
and he was the one that actually Abraham offered, had offer sacrifices for him.
Yeah.
And so here's Abraham having Melchizedek offer sacrifices to God for him. So
Mm-hmm.
he sees him. And now for him, he's a Canaanite. So it doesn't matter that he's a king and a priest. Pagans can do that. In
Right.
fact, it was quite common, but God didn't want that in his nation. In fact, he made it impossible for that to happen, right? You had to
Right.
be a Levite to be a
Mm-hmm.
priest, not from the line of Judah like David was.
Yeah.
So it made it impossible. You couldn't be from both lines. So my understanding is that God has an example here in the Old Testament of a person that's a king and a priest. I
Mm-hmm.
actually think David is going to be that same kind of a person. I'll show you a little evidence in a minute. But I also think Jesus is in that same line. So I'm going to argue that there's
Mm.
only 3 people in the line of Melchizedek, David, and Jesus.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I
Let,
think
let
so.
me
Yeah.
read. Let me read Psalm 110 for you. Here's what it says. "The Lord Yahweh says to my Lord," I think that's David,
Uh,
"sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And the Lord stretched out his strong scepter from Zion, saying, "Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power. In holy array from the womb of the dawn, your youth will be as the dew." Now, here's the next one. Verse 4, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." Now, I don't know how David knew that, or how. I actually
mm.
believe that this psalm was written for David or
Mm.
about David. And if that's true, then the Lord Yahweh said to this person's Lord, who is David,
Yeah.
and then calls him a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So if
Yeah.
that's true, that would actually then make some sense as to why David could actually do that. So I think Psalm 110 helps confirm that David is in that line.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one more. According to Hebrews, Jesus is also in that line. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become high priest, but he said to him, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." Just as he said in another passage, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So I think what happened is it took a passage that was applied to David initially, who it was
Hmm.
referring to, and now has applied that to Christ. Again, that would make a perfect. So David can offer sacrifices because he's in the line of Melchizedek,
Yeah.
unlike all the other kings at that point. Even the kings of Judah couldn't do that.
Hmm.
Jesus is also a king priest, which is in that line. So
Uh-huh.
my understanding that those three can then make that work together. Does that make sense? This is kind of it actually answers some really difficult questions, like why can
Yeah.
David offer sacrifices? Why can he wear a linen ephod unless you've got something like this happening?
Yeah. So I guess I have one question though.
Sure.
Maybe more. Because I think the shape of what you're saying makes sense, but my question would be,
Okay.
when you say like the line of Melchizedek, I mean, I think normally when we're thinking of like a line of Judah or the line of,
Yeah.
the Levites, that's a genealogical, right? That's like you're born into that line.
Yeah.
Is being in the line of Melchizedek, is that something, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah. My understanding is, and Hebrews actually helps us figure this out, is that Jesus is in that line because God said he was his son and that he
Yeah.
was in that line. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
my so my understanding is that he gets to be in that line because of a declaration made by
Yeah.
God.
Okay.
And
That's what I was kind of wondering if that's where we're going to
yeah,
end up, because that kind of, I don't know how else you could say it, but yeah, that kind of makes sense. If
yeah.
God declares it, basically.
Yeah, and Hebrews makes that real clear too.
Yeah.
But I think for it to be applied to David also then
Mm,
makes sense because then he can offer the sacrifices. So
right.
now we've got three in that line, and David is like kind of like a nice go between
Right.
Melchizedek and Jesus.
Yeah.
So I think it actually does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. That's sensible to me.
Yeah. Well, that one's going to be our one of our biggest issues in this Second Samuel part.
Mm,
Okay, then chapter 7 is going to be this covenant made with David that God makes with David, and he tells him that, remember, David wanted to build a temple for God, and God says
hmm.
no, but I'll build a house for you. And there's a play on that word house. It can mean a temple, which is what David was going to build
Hmm.
for God, and God says no, you're a man of war. I'm going to have your son do it.
Yeah.
But he said, I will build a house for you. So it's a
Mm,
play on that word by it, the word for house. Verse 12 through 16
hmm.
is kind of the summary of this Davidic kingdom or Davidic covenant. It says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you. He will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name. So it makes it real clear this is not Jesus. A lot of people have thought this was Jesus, but he
Hmm.
says he will build a house for my name. So it's pretty much Solomon, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. So that means he's got this relationship with him, and a covenantal relationship. Um, but the next phrase also makes sure that this can't be Jesus. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. So that
Yeah.
makes it real clear this can't be him.
Right.
But do you see what that means? God says, "Okay, I'm gonna make this commitment with you, David, that your offspring are going to be on the throne after you, and I'm going to, so if they commit iniquity against me, I'll punish them, but I won't remove it." He's going to say that. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne will be established forever.
Mm.
So I think that's in my mind. Here's this Davidic kingdom or uh, Davidic
In the
covenant that
covenant.
God's
Yeah.
making with David and his offspring after him. Now, the
Hmm.
reason I think he can do it forever is I think that Jesus is also in the line of David. So that
Yeah.
allows for it to. So even though there's going to be a gap in there, the word
Hmm.
olam seems to allow for gaps in it,
Hmm.
but ultimately it's going to be carried on forever. And
Yeah.
so I think that's what's going to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what you've got is a brilliant. I mean, this in my mind, this is one of the crucial covenants in the Old
Mm,
Testament, and
yeah.
it sounds again like this is an unconditional covenant. God says He's going to put His children on the throne, and if they'll disobey, I'll punish them, but I won't ever remove them from the throne again, like He
Yeah.
did with Saul. So
Right.
it sounds like to me they've got see that's why also in Judah it was a lot easier to know who was going to be the king. It was had to be one of
Yeah.
the offsprings of the
Right.
person the king before him. It had to be in
Yeah.
that line. So
Right.
so it is, and that's not true with the Northern Kingdom. I think
Hmm.
there was 5 different dynasties that actually happened in the North where that didn't
Wow.
happen in the South.
Yeah.
So, okay. Then after that, then David's going to pray and he's going to thank God for this amazing promise and all those kind of
Hmm.
things. That's in chapter 8. So probably the next chapter in chapter 8 is going to be all the enemies that David is going to fight and extend his throne, his kingdom. So
Yeah.
this first picture is basically Saul's kingdom. This one here is David's. So you can see it goes all the way up, basically into Syria there, and then all the
Hmm.
way down to the river of Egypt.
Yeah.
Then during Solomon's kingdom, see it goes all the way up to the Euphrates River.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
In Genesis 15, it actually says that God is going to give him the land all the way from the river of Egypt, and I don't think that's the Nile. There's a different term in Hebrew for Nile. So the
Mm.
river of Egypt,
Yeah.
which is
Right.
we call it the brook of Egypt, all the way up to the Euphrates River. I'm going to argue that during Solomon's time, they basically had that area. So the question then
Right.
is, does it need to happen again? And that's a
Hmm.
big theological issue.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, I don't necessarily think it has to happen again. I think once God promises it and it's fulfilled, I don't know that it has to happen again. Could it?
Mm.
I think the answer is yes. Does it have to? I don't think so. So
Yeah.
I do think that Israel will have a land in the future and stuff like that. Back to
Mm.
a dispensational idea, but I
Hmm.
also think that it's happened once. I don't know if God has to do
It's
it
not
again.
necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Does that make sense? He actually goes through and
Yeah.
talks about Philistines, Moabites, Zobah, who's in the north there, and then Syria. Those are all going to be uh, kings or countries that David wipes out and
Yeah.
and
I mean, it's
basically
pretty
control.
extensive. I mean, it's
Yeah.
probably 3 to 4 times. I mean, between Saul and
Yeah.
David, it grows probably 3 to 4 times, something like
Yeah.
that, in terms of area.
Yeah.
And then with Solomon, it continues to grow, but not as much.
And
It's
Solomon's
large.
is basically his is because of alliances with all these people,
Hmm.
where David's was basically conquering the land.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. In chapter 9, David then and Mephibosheth, we have that story.
Hmm.
David provides for Mephibosheth.
Hmm.
Talked about him being a cripple at birth. Um, my guess is he was terrified to come into David's presence. Because think about it. Here, you are one of Saul's offspring. David's now the new king, but David is remember he would not harm the Lord's anointed,
Yeah.
and at this point he doesn't want to be seen as you know totally wiping out the next the former kingdom and becoming the new king. He actually is showing these basically love and fairness to the next
Yeah.
person. So
But even if Mephibosheth knew that about
yeah,
David, there's still fear from other people. I mean, like we saw, I mean, people are willing to
yeah,
kill on behalf of David. It seems like probably to,
yeah,
try to get on his good side, or, they think they're
yeah,
helping him, or showing some kind of allegiance. So there's still danger,
oh
even if
yeah.
David particularly isn't going after you.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so David tells him, "Don't be afraid.
Hmm.
I'm going to actually try to take care of you."
Yeah.
Ziba is interesting. He's Mephibosheth's like servant or right hand man,
Hmm.
and he's going to care for it. Now it's interesting. Mephibosheth. Um, it looks like it comes from the presence of shame or something like that.
Hmm.
Mephibosheth. His name is actually something else in Chronicles. His in Jonathan's son was called Meribbaal.
Hmm.
And so judge between Baal is kind of probably what those two words mean.
Yeah.
But my guess is that Mephibosheth's name was probably Mephibobaal or something like that.
Hmm.
And it's so embarrassing because Baal was the name of a
Yeah.
Canaanite god that it's. I think the biblical writer actually changes it to Mephibosheth. Changes it to Mephibosheth, like
Hmm.
meaning a shame on him or something like that. Um, I,
Right. Right.
I just think it's really funny. It's Chronicles has a totally different name for him,
Yeah.
and
That is pretty
it's
bizarre.
probably because it was built off the name Baal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
which which is sad, but probably true. Baal could
Yeah.
also be the name. It means Lord, right? So it's very
Hmm.
possible that at this point, maybe when Saul called him that
Mm.
maybe it had something to do with maybe he contend with the Lord or something like that, and so it
Yeah.
could be a positive name, but because Baal becomes such a threat to the kingdom, I think what happens is it becomes an
It takes
embarrassment.
on a more
Yeah,
particular meaning.
yeah. So anyway, I thought I'd let you know that.
Yeah.
Chapter 10 talks about Hunan. Um, he misjudges David's. Hunan's father had passed away. And so
Mm.
David was sending up a present and letting him know that he was sorry for him. And Hunan thought that his advisors, at least, thought he was coming to spy out the land so that he could take it. Now, remember,
Mm.
that would be very possible for David because David had taken over a lot of land,
Yeah.
but apparently this
Yeah.
was his intentions were actually very kind, apparently. Anyway, so what they did, and this gives you a little hint about what happens back then. They shaved off half their beard and ripped their clothes, and it was so embarrassing that David tells them to stay in Jericho until your
Right. I
beard
remember
grows
this.
back.
Yeah.
Don't come into Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Imagine having that happen to you. And also remember, if you're doing this to David's messengers,
Right.
basically, that's basically telling him, hey, we're going to war. That's
Yeah.
to humiliate your messengers would be basically the same as tell them, get ready for war. And that's
Yeah.
basically what happens. David
That's what happens.
realizes,
Right.
yeah. So
Yeah.
David goes and defeats the Ammonites, actually.
Hmm.
So that's chapter 10. Then Ammon is high. Ammon is in Syria. So these are countries that are just north of Israel, and
Hmm.
David is now pretty much taking over them. So Ammon hires warriors from Syria and still gets defeated. They do it the next year and claim that that this God, obviously, they can still beat him, so they try again and get defeated again. So David is a man of war, there's no doubt about that, but God was with him and gave him an awful lot of land at that point.
Yeah.
Then in chapter 11 you've got the David and Bathsheba. um,
Yeah.
I think the saddest thing, most everybody knows this story, but I think the
Yeah.
saddest thing about this story is that David tries everything to cover up his sin rather than just go to God and ask
Admitting
for
it.
forgiveness. Now, later
Right.
on, he apparently does. Apparently, Psalm 51
Mm.
seems to be a summary of David actually being sorry for it. But
Mm.
he doesn't seem to do that until Nathan rebukes him in chapter
Right.
12. Yeah. So he seems to do everything. And it even has Uriah the Hittite that
Hmm.
killed, has
Right.
Joab send him to the front of the lines and then pulls back and
Mm.
then he gets killed. It's just,
Yeah.
it's sad what extent David would go to try to hide his sin.
Yeah.
When the best part in chapter 12 is he tells that parable about the little
Yeah.
ewe lamb. Oh,
Yeah.
it's a brilliant story. So much so, David says,
Yeah.
that man should die. And
Right.
Nathan says, well, it's you, David. You were the one
Yeah.
that did that. So
He sets him up to, you know,
yeah,
he brings up David's own sense of justice,
yeah.
which is what convicts him, you know.
Oh, it's a great story, but
Yeah.
it really worked too.
Yeah.
So he basically condemned himself, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So after that, God is now going to start taking away, starting to punish David for that.
Mm-hmm.
Amnon and Tamar is in chapter 13, where
Mm-hmm.
Amnon is one of David's sons, and he so appears to be in love with Tamar. So he calls her into his room and then rapes her basically.
Yeah.
Um, David hears about that, but at this point he can't really, or doesn't feel like he can punish. I think he should have at that point, but he doesn't seem
Mm-hmm.
to.
Yeah.
So Absalom is another one of David's sons. Actually, avenges Tamar in the it was several months later, but when they go to his house to for a feast for I assume it was called the shearing of the sheep or something like that. So it was like a
Mm.
celebration, and at that point Absalom kills him.
Right.
Oh, then we have the woman of Tekoa. This is Joab again. Remember, I told you Joab is gonna do several things that seem like it's against David. This one,
Yeah.
Absalom. Joab knew that David still really loved Absalom, but
Mm.
David had made it so that he couldn't come in. He was forbidden to come into the city. So Joab gets this woman of Tekoa, and Tekoa was known for its wise people. So
Mm.
he gets this woman to tell David a story almost similar to what happened to Nathan.
Yeah.
And David says, "Okay, we'll let him come back." So he actually does let him come back. Um, in chapter 15, though, Absalom starts a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what he does is every time people come in and are supposed to go to David to hear a ruling, he would say, "Well, if I was king, you certainly would have
Yeah.
I would treat you
Right.
much better," and all this.
Yeah.
So,
He's just
so
undermining David. Yeah.
yeah. So David has to flee Jerusalem. I mean, that's got to be
Mm.
embarrassing to have your son take the throne and you have to
Yeah.
flee for your own life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so so David is actually still being punished by God for the sin of
Mm.
Bathsheba kind of thing. Anyway, in chapter 18, Absalom dies, and that was kind of a funny story. He's riding on a donkey, goes under
Yeah.
this oak tree, and his hair is so long that he gets
Yeah.
caught in this tree and is hanging there. His donkey keeps going, and he's hanging there.
Yeah.
And guess what? Joab comes, of all people,
Mm.
comes and throws a spear at him and kills him. Again, stuff you would not expect. I
Yeah.
need to let you know there were five people that met David on the way out of
Mm.
Jerusalem as he was fleeing.
When
One
he's
was
fleeing.
it, yeah. One was Ittai the Gittite. Ittai the Gittite. Um, and I really like him. He's a mercenary, so
Mm.
he's I don't know exactly where Gittite is, Gitti is, but he is a mercenary. He comes, he says, David says to him, "Why are you coming? You don't need to come. You just got here today." And he said, "No, I was here to serve you, and I'm going to
Mm.
serve you." I'm not, oh
Mm.
man, that's quite a guy.
Yeah.
Zadok was another one. He's now the priest, and he's fleeing with David, and David sends him back and says, "Wait a minute, I need you in
Mm.
Jerusalem so that I can hear what Absalom is doing." So he uses
Yeah.
Zadok to be his help. Hushai is another guy that comes to him. He seems to be an older gentleman because we'll hear about him later,
Mm.
but he apparently brings food and stuff like that so that David can make it. And then Ziba was another one. Now remember, Mephibosheth was basically connected with David, and so here goes
Right.
Ziba and says, "Well, David asked him, well, how come Mephibosheth isn't here?" And he says,
Mm.
"Well, my master thought that now is the time when he's going to get the kingdom back, and so it's going to go back to
Mm.
Saul's line." So that's what happens there. Now,
Interesting. Yeah.
when he comes back, it's a different story. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But at this point, that's what Ziba says. So we'll see
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
happens. And then I would never want to be Shimei. The next one, he curses David and throws rocks at him and says, "Now you're getting yours for being such a man of war." And he's of the line of Saul, and so he says,
Yeah.
"And now the line of Saul's going to get their revenge on you," and all
Mm.
this. So he just really lets David have it. I am just amazed. The bad thing is that when David comes back, Shimei is one of the first ones to come and basically get down on his feet. But it's just funny
Yeah.
because David spares his life.
Mm.
Abishag says, "Shouldn't I, Shimei shouldn't live after saying this about the
Mm.
Lord's anointed." And David says, "Well, maybe God told him to say that, so we better let him live and
Wow.
let it go." But then when he comes back, Abishag, the same guy, wants to come and says, "Well, now for sure he should be killed." And David says, "No, nobody should be killed. We know that God's on the throne and he brought me back." And
Yeah.
so I would just hate to be Shimei. Every time he seems to be in the wrong place at the wrong
Right.
time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh well. All right, let's go to the next one. All right. In 2 Samuel 18, there's a passage. Let me read it for you. Now, Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's valley. For he said, "I have no son to preserve my name."
Mm.
So he named the pillar after his own name. Um, Remember how important it was for people to have children to carry on so that people
Oh yeah.
still remember you after you died? So apparently Absalom didn't have any children, so he apparently set up this pillar or statue or something to remind people that he existed and that he was, and that people
Yeah.
would remember him. Now, in Jerusalem today, there is this pillar. You can see a picture of it. That's claimed to be Absalom's pillar. The
Hmm.
problem is the date of this only goes back to the first century AD. So it's
Oh wow.
not the one that goes all the way back to Solomon or to Absalom. But it
Yeah.
is interesting. My guess that it's probably in commemoration of it. So my guess
Mm.
is there was probably one there earlier, and they probably at some point rebuilt something over it, and it
Yeah.
now has either taken on that name or it was intended to do
Mm.
that, one of the two. But just so
Yeah.
you know, if you ever go there, it's not the real
It's not the one.
Absalom's
Yeah.
pillar.
The
You can see, actually, can you see right over on the side? There's the temple wall.
wall. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so you can
Yeah.
actually see about where it's located.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So after Joab kills Absalom, David is really upset, and all the people, the army knows that he's discouraged, and Joab comes to him and says, "Man, I bet that if Absalom was alive today and we all were dead, you'd be happy, David." And he says,
Mm.
"That can't be. These people have fought for you. They've been on your side, and you're
Yeah.
discouraging them." So Joab actually really, I think David needed this,
Mm.
and Joab rebukes him, and this is after he's already killed, at least one
Yeah.
person that was supposed to take his place, and so
Yeah.
David. I think David and Joab have like a love-hate relationship. They know
Yeah.
they need each other, so they don't go against each other, but
Yeah.
there's times when they both really chasing each other or rebuke each other.
Yeah.
It's really something.
It is. It's interesting because, yeah, Joab does seem to be willing to do things on behalf of David that are pretty,
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of terrible, I guess, but
Yeah.
in a sense, they're still good for David.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though he may not like it, it was,
Yeah.
there was one other thing that I forgot to tell you, that when David left, he actually left his concubines in the city of
Mm.
Jerusalem. That was basically like David giving him, Absalom, the possibility of becoming the legitimate
Mm.
king. Um, you know, uh, Basically, they had a harem at that time, and if the former king, once they're dead or something happens to him, they take over that harem. David
Mm.
actually left his in Jerusalem, giving Absalom the possibility of then taking over the throne and being legitimate. So it's
Yeah.
actually kind of funny. Um, Basically, then what happens is David, then when he comes back, he doesn't ever go into that harem anymore, but he's now reestablished as the new king.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's another one. This is the second time now. This guy Amasa, who is general over some of the other tribe or over the other armies, and
Mm.
he was going to give him leadership over David's tribes now instead of
Mm.
Joab. And guess what happens to him too? He's going to be killed by Joab too. So you don't want to ever try to take Joab's place, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. So Sheba is another one that revolts. Now remember, Absalom was one of David's children, so that
Hmm.
he has a legitimate claim to the throne, is my guess. Sheba is as I understand, he's a Benjaminite. So he's not
Mm.
of the line of David, but he thinks that he's had enough, and probably at this time David probably is not doing as well as as
Yeah.
former times, and so I
Yeah.
assume there's going to be lots of people that aren't happy with him.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Sheba tries to revolt, and Amasa again. Anyway, he gets defeated, he gets killed, and Amasa now is the one David wants to put in place of Joab, and Joab kills him. So
Yeah.
it says that Sheba dies at Abel Beth Makkah, which is clear up north, quite a ways up north.
Mm.
So it's an interesting place where he dies. My understanding is that he ended up dying because they actually he had gone to this place, and they were terrified that David was going to destroy them. So he says,
Mm.
"Well, there's a way to get out of this.
Yeah.
Cast his head over the to us in the morning, and we'll spare you." And so
Yeah.
they apparently do that.
Wow.
All right. Okay. So now of the people that come back, so Amasa is the first one, and he was the one
Hmm.
that got David was going to put in place of Joab. He gets
Yep.
killed. Shimei is the next one that comes. Shimei is that, remember, he's the one that cursed David and all this.
Yeah.
And now when he comes back on his knees and says, "Oh, I know I was stupid," and all this kind of stuff. Well,
Yeah.
at that point, that's where Abishag says, "Oh, obviously now he should be killed." And
Mm.
David says, "No, don't do it now." And then Ziba comes, and here's where Ziba, you hear the other side of the story.
Mm.
Mephibosheth comes, and now initially David had given Ziba all of Mephibosheth's land.
Mm.
Now they come back, and Mephibosheth comes with his beard in, having washed and all that kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
so like a sign of mourning, and
Mm.
and so
Yeah.
David. What's funny is David doesn't say, "Here, let's check and see what's going on." What he just says is, "Here, just take the land and split it between you." So rather than say, so we never know if Ziba was
Mm.
telling the truth or not, but David just at this point just says, "Okay, split the land between you." But it was funny
Interesting.
because earlier he had said to Ziba he could have it all. He could have Mephibosheth's land. So we never
Right.
know for sure if Mephibosheth was lying or if Ziba was lying.
Right.
But at the end, they're supposed to split the land. So apparently David didn't want to mess with it. So
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And then Barzillai is another one who comes back. He's a friend of
Hmm.
David, and he was the one that had helped him earlier too to have
Mm.
some food and stuff like that. He was a friend of his, and so David says, "Well, why don't you come and live in the throne, in the city with
The
me, and I'll
palace or
take care
whatever.
of you and
Yeah.
all that." And he says, "I'm so old. Even if you gave me great food, I can't taste it anyway. So what good does it do?" So he takes his son to be with him,
Ah.
and
Yeah.
so in honor of this Barzillai guy. So
Yeah.
it's kind of funny. Those people who meet David, some of them are scared to death to have met him, like Shimei, and should have been,
Yeah.
but David spares them.
Yeah.
All right. Here's the story about Sheba dying.
Hmm.
In Second Samuel 20, 1-3, it says, a worthless fellow happened to be there whose name was Sheba, the son of Birki, a Benjaminite. And he blew the trumpet and said, "We have no portion in David, nor we have an inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his own tent. Now that terminology is quite similar to what it is. So, what they had said earlier, you're bone of our bones and flesh of our
Yeah.
flesh. He's now saying, well, we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. So apparently you could give that up real easy, apparently.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's see. Okay, so all the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba, the son of Birhi. But the men of Judah remained
Mm.
steadfast to their king, from the Jordan even to Jerusalem. Then David came to his house in Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, the concubines who he'd left to keep house, and placed them under guard and provided them with sustenance, but did not go into them. See, remember I told you about
Mm-hmm.
David left them? That was a really, well, it was intentional, I think, because he was basically giving up, it sounds like,
Yeah.
to let his son take the throne. Yeah. So they were shut up there till the day of their death, living as widows.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the best way of handling it, but I'm also not sure
Yeah.
he should have left them there. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Okay, here's a story about Sheba. Now, verse 22 in 2 Samuel 20. The women wisely came to all the people, or the women wisely came to the people, and they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Birhi, and threw it to Joab. He blew the trumpet, and they dispersed from the city, each to his tent. Joab also returned to the king at Jerusalem. So
Mm.
that's remember I told you that they made a deal with him, and
Yeah.
they killed Sheba. He didn't make such a wise move on this
Yeah.
part.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Now we're at the last part of David's life. Basically, I call this an appendix, and we've got about 3 chapters of appendixes. There's a famine and warfare. The first one was, remember the Gibeonites.
Mm.
Apparently, Saul had 7 of the sons of the Gibeonites killed. And remember, initially, they made a covenant in God's name that they should always be protected. They were going to be
Mm.
hewers of wood and drawers of water, but they were supposed to be protected. And apparently, Saul killed some of them.
Yeah.
So there was a 3-year famine as punishment for that. And it goes back to Joshua 9. I've got this where they make that agreement with them. But that's kind of an interesting story. And then God upholds this and wants Israel,
Yeah.
realizing that Saul should have never done that. Then in chapter 21, we've
Mm.
got another war with the Philistines. Verse 15
Mm-hmm.
says, now when the Philistines were at war again with David, or with Israel, David went down with his servants with him, and they fought against the Philistines. And David became weary. Then Ishbenob, who was among the descendants of the giants, um, I don't know if you remember when the Israelites came in the land, they said the sons of Anak there, those tall people.
Oh yeah.
My guess is
Yeah.
that this guy was probably related to Goliath and those guys that were tall
Mm.
back there. All right. And notice that they're in the Philistines again, just like David
Yeah.
earlier had the Goliath. All right.
Yeah.
The weight of his spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight. I weighed that out. It's about 9 pounds. So that's the spearhead was 9
Yeah. Just the
pounds. So I
tip. Yeah.
assume that's pretty heavy. He
Yeah.
was girded with a new sword, and he intended to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, helped him and struck the Philistine and killed him. And the men of David swore to him, saying, "You shall not go again with us to battle, so that you will not
Mm.
extinguish the lamp of Israel." Later on, it says, "Man, one of us could be, 100 of us could be killed, and it doesn't matter. But if you get killed, the battle's over."
Yeah.
And so I think it was wise, but I think that's also telling you that David was starting to get
Yeah.
older and not
Right.
as strong as he used to be. Because
Yeah.
remember, initially there was no battles that he lost. He was an
Right.
amazing
Yeah.
warrior. So,
Yeah.
but it's kind of interesting to hear this guy here is again. So those sons of Anak seem to become popping up every once in a while, and here's
Yeah.
another one.
Yeah.
So. All right, we've got a couple more things. This one is actually interesting. In Psalm 8, you've got in 2 Samuel 21, you've got a quote from Psalm 18. And
Hmm.
what's interesting here is it even quotes the title. Let me go to it.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
So I'm in chapter 22. Here's what it says. And David spoke the words of this song to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, and then it goes into the psalm. So it is actually quoting the psalm title and then goes into the psalm. What's
Mm.
interesting to me on this is people have questioned whether the psalm titles were legitimate or not, or whether
Mm.
they were added later.
Yeah.
This at least now the issue on this. Remember, Second Samuel is probably written after most of the Psalms were written because
Mm.
it goes all the way to the exile. So
Yeah.
it's probably written after at least a lot of the Psalms are written. So the question is was that Psalm title added, and then this quotes that Psalm title, even though it was added later or not? When we get
Yeah.
to Psalms, we'll talk about Psalm titles, and I think it'll make some more sense.
Mm.
But this is going to be one of the pieces of evidence to suggest that at least Psalm titles were added at least sometime earlier. Okay,
Yeah.
because Second Samuel is written so late, I'm not sure we can know exactly when it was added, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
I
pretty
just thought
fascinating.
that's kind of a fun one. Yeah, and
Yeah.
we'll talk more about that when we get to Psalms because that'll make sense.
Yeah.
All right, then it talks about God delivering Saul from his enemy, or David from his enemy Saul.
Mm.
So it's kind of a song on that. Um,
Yeah.
in chapter 22, verse 21, it talks about David. He rewarded David's obedience, which
Mm.
actually then is kind of a good summary of David's life, I think.
Yeah.
And then chapter 23, we've got what's called David's last song. Um, I'm going to just read just a part of this because I want you to see what it says. Now, these are the last words of David, the son of David, the son of Jesse, declares. The man who is raised up on high declares, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. So this is what David kind of summarizes
Mm.
his life, and he talks about him being the anointed of God. So he
Yeah.
remember all his life he knew he was the one that God had chosen, and he's called the sweet psalmist of Israel. So apparently, remember a lot of psalm titles
Right.
are connected with David, and
Yeah.
this is probably one of the logical reasons why.
Right.
So,
Right.
all right. So I thought you should see that. Um, Let me show you one more thing. It talks about in chapter 23, talks about his mighty men. There were 37 in all. Now, I don't know if there were more than the ones that are recorded here, because David
Mm.
always had this kind of a special group of people that protect him. They were called his mighty men. And
Mm-hmm.
and man, it goes through and it explains some of the feats that they had done. And these guys were amazing.
Yeah.
Abishag, remember, had spared David's life and
Mm.
killed that giant so that
Yeah.
he didn't get David. So it's kind of interesting. It's amazing what he's done there, but it's fun to read through and just see how amazing these warriors are that
Yeah.
protected David.
Yeah.
In chapter 24, we've got David taking a census, and
Mm.
and it's kind of funny because even Joab knows that he shouldn't be doing this.
Mm.
Let me verse 24 in 2 Samuel 24:1 says, "Now again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them, saying, 'Go number Israel and Judah.'" My guess is that when you number them, the reason you number them is so that you know how strong you are in battle. And even Joab says, does it matter? We know that
Yeah.
God's protected us and God's been fighting for us. Does it matter how many people we have?
Yeah.
So it seems interesting that even Joab tells him not to do it.
Yeah.
David is going to have to. David has three options, and he chooses the plague. And he says, "I'd rather be given into the hand of the Lord than to have men come after me,"
Mm.
because he at least thought God would be somewhat gracious. And the plague was pretty bad, but then God
Yeah.
does call it off at the end, or at least
Mm.
before even more people were killed.
Yeah.
But Chronicles has an interesting repetition of this. It quotes the same thing. And in First Chronicles 21:1, it actually says, then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel.
Mm.
So I think it's interesting. Here's what I would say. Remember, Chronicles is one of the last books in the Bible. By
Yeah.
usually most people think around 400 BC. So
Mhm.
if it's one of the latter, maybe by that time they had a more developed understanding of who it is that goes against God. So
Yeah.
uh, the first one in Samuel, they don't contradict each other, I don't think, because I
Mm.
think Samuel sees God as overarching everything, so that nothing could happen to Israel unless God okays it.
Yeah.
But Chronicles seems to be more specific at saying that it was Satan that actually incited David to do this. So I
Yeah.
think by that time they had a more developed understanding. And this one is interesting because every time Satan is used before this, and that's the transliteration of the word, every time
Yeah.
before this, it has an article on it, the Satan, the
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
deceiver.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the only place where it doesn't have an article. So my guess
Mm.
is that this is a proper name, and they knew that
Right.
by that time there was a deceiver who actually is a person
Yeah.
that we learn about. So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. So I don't think those two verses go against each other, but I think they work together and help us to see that there was a developed concept by that time.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. All right. So David numbers the people. Um, my guess is to determine their strength. I don't know. But
Hmm.
verse 12 says, when you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, then each one of them shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord. Then you shall number them so that there will be no plague among them when you number them. Now that was in Exodus. And my guess is that maybe that they were supposed, when they took a census, they were supposed to do this to somehow to appease the Lord's wrath, so there wouldn't be a plague. So maybe
Mm.
during David's time they didn't do that, and maybe that's what the problem was.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, at least that gives some logic as to why that would happen.
Yeah. Why it was such a severe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, off the side there, I've got this Joshabab Basar Ebeth
Hmm.
killed 800 Philistines at one time.
He's one of the
That
mighty
was
men.
yeah, that was one of the mighty men. So that gives
Yeah.
you some clue of the things they had done.
Yeah.
800 Philistines at once. That's pretty
It's a feat.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. There were 3 days of pestilence that David had determined, and
Mm.
that was one of David's options. It says that 70,000 people die. My guess is that if this was to find out from David, have David to see how strong they were and stuff like that, then having this many people die, now they've got even less people. So my
Yeah.
guess is it was a punishment more specifically to David, and it would fit the
Right.
crime pretty well. So,
Yeah.
so at least I think that's possibly what's going on.
Yeah.
All right. Then in chapter 24, it says, now again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David to say, go number Israel and Judah. And the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, go about and go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and register the people, that I may know the number of the people. But Joab said to the king, now may the Lord your God add to your people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of the Lord my king see it. But why does the Lord delight in this thing? So here's Joab trying to spare David from doing a stupid thing, apparently.
Yeah.
So yeah, so remember I told you that, but that's actually the passage that lets us know that Joab was trying to help him. And
Yeah.
then at the same time, they remember they have this. He has this plague that happens among them, and
Hmm.
80 or 70,000 people are dying. It stopped at the threshing floor of Aruna.
Mm.
Verse 16 says, then the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. The Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who's destroying the people, it is enough. Now relax your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Aruna, the Jebusite. And then
Mm.
remember, it tells you that it's outside of Jerusalem. And
Yeah.
remember, the temple is going to be, uh, David's going to buy this, and that's where the temple is going to be. Solomon takes it
Right.
over.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting the kind of things match up. So
Yeah.
so David buys this, and then Solomon actually builds the temple there. So
Yeah.
it's kind of neat. So it basically commemorates God stepping in and
Mm,
stopping the destruction. So it's
yeah.
kind of neat. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I thought you should know about that one.
Yeah.
Verse 16 or 17 says, And David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel was striking down the people and said, Behold, it is I who have sinned. It is I who have done wrong. But these sheep,
Right.
what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house. So Gad came to David that day and said to him, Go erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. And then Araunah said, Why has my lord the king come to his servant? And David said, To buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be held back from the people. Araunah said to David, Let my lord the king take it and offer it up what is good in his sight. For look, the altar or the oxen and the for the burnt offering, and the threshing floor, threshing sledges, and the yoke for the oxen and the wood. However, the king said to Araunah, No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which costs me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver.
Mm.
Yeah. So that's kind of the background of what happened for that story. So I think it's really important that you hear that, and that's going to be where the temple is actually
Where the temple comes in.
made
Yeah.
up. Yeah. There's again just to remind us that David's kingdom was actually quite extended a long time. He had made like you said he had over double it, probably 3 times the land that they had when
Yeah.
Saul was king.
Yeah.
All right, are you ready for some questions?
Yeah. Let's do it.
All right. What do we learn from the life of David?
Man. Oh, so much.
Yeah.
Obedience seems to be a word I think that would be an important thing we can learn from David of uh, what happens the way God blesses David when he is obedient, and then the
Yeah.
pain that comes when he's disobedient.
Yeah. And remember, when we're going to learn this when we get to the kings too. But remember, the king has a pretty important job. He's
Mhm.
actually God's go-between the people and him. So when he disobeys, it's taking a
Yeah, the
whole
people suffer.
yeah, the people too. So it's
Yeah.
it's it's kind of sad but true, and I think that's important too that we add to that. All
Yeah.
right, what do we learn about God from these history books?
Yeah, there's a lot there too. I mean, certainly there's appropriate and inappropriate ways to relate to God. There are kind of when he says something he means it, and he
Okay.
does expect obedience in these ways. But also, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting, like you pointed out, that there's a developing understanding of God.
Yeah.
I mean, just like you pointed out between um, Samuel and Chronicles, this kind of
Yeah.
development of the idea of who Satan is. We're as Israel progresses, they're getting a more and more nuanced understanding of who God is.
Yeah. They're learning quite a lot, aren't they?
Yeah,
Yeah. Good and bad for them. How
yeah.
does God direct history?
Oh, all kind of ways.
Okay.
What it makes me think of is at the very beginning, our Hebrew word of the day of anointed.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of people that God chooses, who sometimes are insiders, they're obedient, maybe even good. And then sometimes it's people completely outside, but he uses them to punish or direct
Yeah.
things or to make things happen,
Yeah.
and get certain outcomes, I think, out of the people.
And that one also, it doesn't even matter if they're Israelite. He can use
Yeah, right.
anybody. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And then remember on Cyrus, he's going to let the people go back. So, I mean, God can
yeah,
direct the mind of the king even.
yeah,
So, which is what Proverbs tells us.
yeah,
All
right.
right. Is God ever disappointed?
Oh man,
Remember,
that seems like a loaded question.
well, remember he says that he's disappointed that Saul
Hmm.
disobeyed God.
Yeah,
Yeah. No,
yeah.
yeah. Go on.
uh, Well, it's interesting when you think about all that God knows. It seems like for us, disappointment is when we're expecting one thing and the outcome is different. So God
Yeah.
knows all the outcomes. So it has to be a bit different.
Yeah.
Um, but there must be something there, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think when God, I think God can be hurt by our actions,
Hmm.
and so we do things that can actually hurt God. And I thought that was important for us to remember that when we sin, we actually do hurt God, and
Hmm.
that because He loves us so much, that actually hurts Him. And I and
Yeah.
I think that's actually really good for us because then we realize, oh man, it's not it's He has a relationship with us and He wants us to be good, and yet here we disobey. Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah, yeah. I thought that was important. Okay, what's the purpose for the book of First and Second Samuel?
Hmm. Well, I think on one level we're getting kind of the history of the development of the kingdom, right? Like Israel decides they want a king, and we're going to kind of see how that goes and how
Okay, yeah,
eventually David's line gets set up. And I think probably the bigger picture of the whole Bible, we're getting a lot of groundwork and things that make a lot more sense when the New Testament comes around and looks back on it for
yeah,
how who Jesus is, and all
yeah.
the things that he fulfills. There's a lot of foundation being laid, I think.
And remember, we talked about that Davidic covenant
Mm,
that's going to stretch right into the New Testament
yeah,
and allow for that. So I think you're right. I think we're laying a foundation here that is so crucial. And you're going to
yeah,
find out you've got David, a man after God's own heart. So you
mm,
learn that God has a relationship and He cares about us, and all
yeah,
this stuff that we're learning is kind of amazing. And we're learning it through history books. My
right,
wife hates history, and yet I'm thinking, I'm thinking, look what we're learning about God just through this
yeah,
history. Yeah.
yeah,
All right, here we go. Here's some conclusions. The time of the kings was still a very wicked time, especially in the northern kingdom. But the
hmm
first part of Solomon's rule is probably the highlight. And
mm,
David starts off good, but then he has some major flaws, but then
yeah,
he asked for forgiveness, and so I think it's still helpful. But
yeah,
Solomon, at the beginning of Solomon's first rule, or when he first begins to reign, it is amazing. I mean, you can see the kingdom getting broader and bigger, um,
mm,
but it doesn't take long before even him, one of our best
yeah,
kings, now starts to fall.
yeah,
So sad but true. Samuel appears to be a good judge, but his children do not turn out well. Uh,
right,
I just think we need to remember we can do a lot of the right things, and still our kids may not come out the way that we
mm,
want them to. And
mm,
it's sad but true. But Samuel, one of God's people, it happens to him.
yeah,
David, it happens to him. So
hmm
Saul starts out good, but can't seem to obey God.
right,
Saul seems like to me to be a real disappointment, and
yeah,
even to God, it's kind of sad.
hmm
Even David has minor or major flaws, and his kingdom is actually punished for it. And
yeah,
then Joab seems to get away with a lot of things that made David mad, but he still keeps him on. And I think there
yeah,
must have been a love hate relationship between them.
yeah,
And then the last one, David is very kind to Shimei, but he will ultimately be punished. That'll happen in the
mm,
next
mm,
book what we talk about.
yeah,
So it is interesting. I think it's good for David to be so generous. Remember, he claimed to
mm,
be a man of war, so much so that he couldn't build the temple, and yet several times he actually shows great restraint. It seems like to me, and he's quite
yeah.
kind. So
Yeah, he does. I mean, kind of
yeah,
throughout his life. I mean, I
yeah,
always think of whenever he shows restraint later on. I always think of when he showed restraint when he had an opportunity to kill Saul.
yeah,
He seems to have a good sense of the orders of justice. I guess
yeah,
that justice is really in God's hands. You
yeah,
know.
yeah. That's great. Well, we made it through First and
Yeah,
Second Samuel now.
that's great. Yeah, yeah. This is two of my favorite books. I love First, Second
Yeah.
Samuel.
Yeah, a lot of stuff has happened in there. And now we're going to get into the Kings and we'll see what
Hmm.
happens there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. See you next week.